prison, he crushed the movement, and he won by 99.91% of the vote. 99.91% of the vote. I wonder if there could have been a connection there. And after that time, he did vary. I think he went down to 95, maybe 93%, but in that vicinity. One could run the same stats on Mr. Mubarak. And even after when things got a little cleaner in Mubarak's election, still rigged but not that nasty, then a new set of elections would come along in the next ones, and you'd have the same kind of problem. People, for example, in no strong opposition parties, the leading opposition were often the Islamic parties because they were willing to go to prison, fairly consistently. And so, for example, in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood, 6 months before elections, people would be arrested with no cause, not brought to trial, and held. In the lead up, there would be harassment, arrest, torture of other members. It was always very well known, but never reported here, when there was the shock in 2005 and the Muslim Brotherhood came out with something like 20% of the vote, nobody pointed out that the reason they didn't do any better was they knew that they had to limit the number of candidates that ran. If they ran too many candidates and did too well, they would simply be crushed and arrested. So, why do these Mukhabarat states get nervous? Well, if you're Ben Ali in Tunisia, for example, going back 30 years, and the movement gets 17% of the vote in the city and 40% outside, but against what odds? It has no access to media. It is not allowed to meet publicly without permission, and therefore not allowed to meet. Anybody that supports that movement could lose its job, could lose their job or be imprisoned. And remember, governments in the Arab world often are the main employers. They have huge bureaucracies, bloated bureaucracies. They have big military and police. They control the educational system, so they pay the schools, etc. Many of them control the religious establishment, pay their salaries, so that if you vote, you've got a problem. In one country years ago, which is now a democracy, Indonesia, they made it easy for people who voted. Under Mr. Suharto, they decided to be benign. Look, why should you have to go out in bad weather and vote? We're going to come right to the workplace. And what we're going to do is we're going to have these boxes. And to make it easy for you, so, if you're tired or you're a little illiterate, we'll color code the ballots. And then you will put the ballots in the box. Of course, you won't be in a private space. So, others will be able to see who you're voting for. But we're making it easy for you. You can just vote right in the workplace. Okay. So these are the kinds of governments that we were supporting. But because of the strength of the security forces, because of the extent to which the government could repress, you had a number of beliefs out there and expectations. Number one, you had a track record of rulers who were in for what? 20, 25, 30, 40 years. Certainly wouldn't take a brilliant person to say, we think he's in control. And we think he can crush any and all opposition. And they had track records of doing it, okay? No strong political parties, so in elections, good chance. We saw the handoff, as in football, that occurred in Syria from father to son. We knew the rumors, both in Libya and in Egypt, that the entrenched presidents would stay as long as they could, and that they were hoping to groom their sons for a handoff of power. Okay. And they, the rulers, and many of our, what I call neocon mentality people here, who have a problem with Arab and Muslim culture, told us that there's something about Arab and Muslim culture that has a problem with democracy, and that's why they don't have democracy. Not that they don't have democracy because they have authoritarian rulers who came to power, seized power, inherited power, used their security forces, and were supported by Europe and America, and provided often with the weapons and the training to do that. But rather, it must be something about their culture. Now, one of the things that the pro-democracy movements have proven has been to confirm the polling data, but also to demonstrate that it's not that most of these people are culturally have a problem with democracy, but because of that, there were all those expectations. And also, we bought the very fear the degree of fear that these countries promoted, that Israel promotes, and that the Arab authoritarian regimes promote, which is, if not us, chaos. If not us, the fundamentalists. You can count on us. Just give us the aid. Let us have strong security. And when it comes to critical issues like Palestine and Israel, or oil, or whatever, you can count on us. Whereas if you get an independently minded group, we never thought about that middle ground and said, well, you might, obviously, if you get an alternative, chances are they're going to be more independent minded. Therefore, you can't count on them to the same extent. But that's what democracy is about. We don't expect anybody to visit the very standards that we were falling into on us. You know, we feel free vis-a-vis the world to say we take our stand where we see it in terms of our principles and values. Not that we have to measure up to somebody's expectation. You know, we would probably, we would certainly be insulted, it seems to me, if in fact, rather than putting it subtly, very strongly, many of these authoritarian rulers were to say, now listen, Barack, listen, you got our support. We expect you to do X, and we're really disappointed that you haven't gone far enough. That simply wouldn't happen. Members of our Congress wouldn't tolerate, you know, that kind of rhetoric vis-a-vis our own country. So nobody expected this to happen. The rulers didn't expect it to happen. Their military and security forces didn't expect this kind of pro-democracy. Nobody expected a non-violent, first of all, kind of movement. B, nobody expected that they wouldn't be crushed immediately. Nobody expected that people would continue to come out in the streets and risk being killed, being maimed, you know, etc. And do it, you know, day in and day out. Nobody expected that Bahrainis, you know, would continue to do it. And nobody had a sense of the depth of the way Tunisians and Egyptians were really feeling. Because part of it would be, how would we know? If you went over to Tunisia or Egypt, you know, I get friends who would say things like, well, I know how they're feeling because, you know, I was in a cab and I struck up a really good conversation with the cab driver and we developed a relationship. And so I asked him how he felt about this party or that party or their ruler. Are you out of your mind? In a country where the cab driver can't trust anybody, can't even trust his next door neighbor, he's now going to meet you and talk honestly, you know? And he's really going to do it because you're fluent in Arabic. Rather than saying you're an American who's fluent in Arabic, probably a spy, or from the American embassy, and is going to get back. Do you know what I mean? On the one hand, people will say you don't know our language, but the problem is when you do know the language, you know, people think, you know, and who are you working for? You know, or oh yeah, you're the nice guy from the embassy, or with USAID. Okay, so no one expected it. So what do we learn from this movement? Where is this movement going, and how has the U.S. and how have Europe handled it? The predominance of autocrats and authoritarian governments in much of the Arab world and the Middle East, with their entrenched security apparatus and military, had led many of their citizens to question whether democratic change would occur in their lifetime. I was interviewing a young man, 28 years old, in Egypt. He's very bright, does a lot of you know, good writing, blogging, invited to the U.S. at times for discussions on democracy, even by sort of, you know, major groups, the equivalent of, let's say, the Council on Foreign Affairs, or even sometimes by government supported, and then all of a sudden he couldn't leave the country because he wrote some stuff that the Mubarak government didn't like. And I was talking about the attitude of people and youth. And he made a statement. He said, you know, he said, remember, he said, that people of my generation, the only president we've known is Mubarak. But that's not the interesting thing. What he's really saying is the only political culture we've known is Mubarak. In other words, we've grown up in a society where we know what the limits of free speech are, where we know what the repercussions are, where we know that for many of us that we have no great future, that unless we're part of the elites, etc., you know, the entrenched elites, there is no sort of really great future for us, you know, within this country. Better still, I had a Palestinian who works in the Gulf send a message to people and said, here's a message with no verbal communication. And what it was a picture of presidents of the United States going back to Reagan or before Reagan. Okay, so we had all the American presidents, and then we had the equivalent in Egypt. And all you saw was Mubarak, 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 next to all these to really get in. Now, in other words, so therefore one has to think about what that does in a society. You know, what future do youth have? You know, high unemployment rates. Even when the economy was looking good in Tunisia, who was benefiting? Still high unemployment rates for those that, you know, needed the boost that they needed. Even take a look at Saudi Arabia, as relatively speaking, as well as people did. What did the king just go back and do? Give billions and billions of dollars to help who? Lower and middle class people. Even in Oman, which has been seen as a very stable, you know, quiet place, where in fact the Sultan is very widely respected. I just was in Oman about a week and a half ago. Even there, the Sultan has promised 50,000 new jobs. Okay? So in that kind of context, growing up in that kind of culture, in a culture that is a culture of repression, of limitations, even those that make it in the system know how far you can go. Suppose you're very well educated, you're an international lawyer, you really care about human rights in your country, okay? But if you're going to live in Egypt and your kids are going to get jobs, etc., you know what the limits are. You can push for reforms, but you know how far you can go. And those limits are really quite limited, okay? And there are enough celebrated cases to make that. Despite the growing discontent, few predicted or expected that anytime soon there'd be popular nonviolent uprisings by pro-democracy movements. It just was seen as inconceivable. The repercussions of the toppling of the Egyptian government, of the Tunisian government, of the threat of that happening now in Libya and possibly in Yemen, and of the need for governments to be more responsive in places like Bahrain, Jordan, even Oman. Those repercussions have demonstrated to people in the region, and that's what Tunisia did for Egypt. It was, oh my God, there's a possibility that change could really happen. If we can somehow unite, however different we are, if we can somehow have the courage to go out into the square and into the streets and take the risks, we might actually be able to do it. And it gave people a sense of empowerment. For so many people in that part of the world, when you lack empowerment, you cease to be self-critical at all. So yes, you're right in saying our problems come from our government and Western governments that support, but you have a sense that you have no power to change your future. Once you're convinced of that, you see, then you don't empower yourselves. My analogies are always terrible. They are terrible, but I still forge on. And an example is the women's movement. Whether it was in Egypt or the US, one could talk about patriarchy, the power of the patriarchy. But if women had only expected that it would always have to be men who would empower them, well, the first thing that you're acknowledging is not only you don't have any power, but that you cannot move to that first stage of empowering yourself. That is of saying, I have rights. The problem is you're not giving them to me, rather than I need to get you, Daddy, to give me those rights and acknowledge those rights. There's that delicate balance, you know. And if you feel that the government is all powerful and you have no power, then there's really no reason to carry on. A lot of that changed. And we see that the placard that was in Egypt and that they kept there, which in effect said, we don't need you, America, to make this happen. It wasn't meant to be an anti-American comment. It was meant to say, you know, we're doing it on our own, we're going to do it on our own, and this is very important. It's very important for us to realize that also. The end of these regimes has brought into sharp contrast our belief that popular sovereignty, self-determination, and the desire for these things and freedoms are somehow things that were unimaginable, that Arabs and Muslims wouldn't want. You know, we can say it now. I said this after 9/11, but I like to play on this for a little while because I kind of enjoy rubbing it in. You know, the idea that we would say, Well, the real problem is, they're just not like us. It's all cultural and civilization. It has nothing